In Act 1, Scene 1 of King Lear, the Earl of Kent and the Earl of Gloucester are talking about what's been happening in the kingdom. Kent asks about Gloucester's son Edmund, and Gloucester jokes about Edmund's conception. King Lear enters with the Dukes of Albany and Cornwall, his daughters Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia, and some servants. Lear says he's ready to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters. He'll give the largest portion to the daughter who loves him most. Goneril and Regan both give over-the-top and gushing answers, so Lear gives each of them a third of his kingdom. He then asks Cordelia, who refuses to make any outrageously ostentatious claim about how much she loves him. She says her love is richer than her tongue. Furious, Lear disowns Cordelia and splits her third of the kingdom between her 2 sisters. Kent tries to advise the king against his actions, so Lear banishes Kent for interfering. Cordelia's suitors, the Duke of Burgundy and the King of France, enter. When Burgundy learns Cordelia no longer carries a dowry, he decides not to marry her. But the King of France accepts Cordelia as his wife without a dowry. Everyone leaves except the King of France and Lear's 3 daughters. Cordelia tells her sisters, "I know you what you are, and like a sister am most loath to call your faults as they are named. Love well our father." Regan tells Cordelia to leave them alone. Goneril says Cordelia needs to focus on pleasing her husband. So, Cordelia and her husband leave. Once Goneril and Regan are alone, they talk about how Lear is changing with age and how they'll need to act to address this. In this first scene, Shakespeare introduces all the themes of the play, and he sets all of the plot threads in motion. Kent and Gloucester's discussion of recent events in the country signals that their king is changing and that more change is to come. King Lear repeatedly refers to Cordelia as his favorite, saying she is our joy. However, as soon as she doesn't conform to his expectations, he changes completely. Lear's reaction to his daughter's responses shows that he's in an odd place mentally. He either doesn't know his family nearly as well as he thinks he does, or he's willing to accept everyone at face value. As for his daughters, they immediately show their true natures when they talk amongst themselves. When her sisters dismiss Cordelia's concern and treat their father's actions toward them not as their good fortune but as something to be upset about, they signal their selfishness. Finally, in addition to the themes of family relations, aging, and order, Shakespeare introduces the theme of vision, particularly how important it is, and demonstrating what happens when Lear, and to a lesser extent Gloucester, lack it. Both men are heads of their families and carry considerable social authority, but neither can see who his children truly are or how his actions will influence them. In Act 1, Scene 2 of King Lear, at the Earl of Gloucester's castle, the Earl of Gloucester's son Edmund enters, ranting about his status as a bastard and how he plans to displace his legitimate brother Edgar. He furiously explains, talking about his brother, that Edmund the base shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now, gods stand up for bastards. Gloucester enters, and Edmund uses a letter supposedly written by Edgar to manipulate his father into thinking Edgar plans to betray him. Gloucester explodes, saying he'll arrest Edgar, but Edmund interjects, cautioning him against moving without proof, and makes plans to get more evidence of Edgar's plots. Once Gloucester leaves, Edmund reflects on how people create their own destinies and then find excuses for their actions in the heavens. Edmund is mainly focused on people's weaknesses of character, particularly that of a sexual nature, and their tendency to blame their mistakes on the gods. Edgar enters, and Edmund manipulates his brother, making him think their father is angry with him. Edgar thinks some villain hath done me wrong. Edmund keeps up his charade, telling Edgar that that's his fear too, and that Edgar should arm himself. In the first scene, Gloucester jokes about having an illegitimate son. This scene shows what this means to the characters. Gloucester might joke about the details of Edmund's conception, but the absence of a marriage between Gloucester and this woman has effectively ruined Edmund's life. His illegitimacy not only drives him, but defines him. Edmund is able to manipulate his father quite easily, and this scene reveals the nature of their relationship to the audience. On the surface, Gloucester loves his son and trusts him implicitly. Darker and more likely interpretations are that Gloucester doesn't know or understand either of his sons, and as a result, he can't know how to act in relation to them. This scene is thematically linked to the first scene through the disruption of social order and through dysfunctional family relationships. Finally, this scene introduces a plot device that will quickly become symbolic: the letter. In Act 1, Scene 3 of King Lear at the Duke of Albany's place, Goneril consults with her steward Oswald, complaining about how her father and his men have been acting. Oswald reports that Lear recently hit one of Goneril's servants because the servant scolded Lear's fool. Goneril says Lear complains about everything, and what's more, his knights are getting out of hand. She tells Oswald that if her father asks, tell him she's sick, and also that Oswald and the other servants should be less attentive to the knights, and even to King Lear himself. This early scene shows the process of social disintegration that marks King Lear. Either Lear's men have been misbehaving, or they've been behaving as they always have, and this is the first time Goneril has had to deal with it. Either way, her irritation shows how little slack she's willing to cut her supposedly beloved father. Goneril's discussion with Oswald also shows how readily she turns to lies. Rather than speaking with her father directly, Goneril's first instinct is to lie and be rude. She also shows a casual disregard for the social order, telling her servant to show less respect for the king, a serious offense. Finally, this scene is the first in which a pivotal event takes place off-stage, a device Shakespeare uses throughout King Lear that shifts the audience's focus, as they cannot simply watch Lear's knights and conclude for themselves that they are being rude. Instead, the scene becomes about character and judging character. In Act 1, Scene 4 of King Lear, Kent enters a hall that the Duke of Albany's, having disguised himself so he can stay near Lear, despite the fact of Lear having banished him. When Lear enters with his knights, the disguised Kent talks his way into Lear's service. King Lear wants to know who he is, and he replies that he's a man. That's good enough for the king. As advised by Goneril, Oswald is repeatedly rude to Lear, prompting Lear and the disguised Kent to talk about how they've been mistreated. Lear sends one servant to fetch his daughter and another to fetch the fool. While he's waiting, Oswald re-enters. When he speaks rudely again to Lear, Lear hits Oswald and Kent trips him. The fool enters and remarks on how Kent is foolish to join Lear's company. When the fool teases Lear about the situation he's set up with his daughters, Lear threatens to whip him. The fool gives Lear advice and then returns to chiding the king for giving away his crown, calling him a fool. When Goneril enters, she and Lear clash over how his company has been acting and the duties a daughter owes a father. They go back and forth about these issues, sometimes the king inserting Albany into the mix, until Lear storms out, saying he will go stay with his daughter Regan instead. Goneril sends her sister a letter to warn her. Though Act 1, Scene 4 is a single scene, there are 4 distinct beats or developments within it. Kent demonstrates his loyalty to Lear. He's willing to risk death to stay with him. And in doing so, he also demonstrates one of the play's complexities, showing that not all deception is wrong. Instead, the value of a deceptive act, in Kent's case, disguising himself, is determined by its intent. Oswald's mistreatment of Lear and the knights demonstrates the fraying of the social order within the kingdom. Another important event has happened off stage, leaving the audience to wonder whether Goneril's household is mistreating Lear's company or if Lear and his men are out of hand. The Fool's commentary introduces an interesting theme, the value of foolishness or madness. The Fool turns the order of things upside down in mocking Lear and offering Lear the hat of the court jester. Lear becomes the fool, and the fool becomes the wise man in this not-so-subtle turn of fortune. The fool comments on Lear's failing condition and says, "Thou art nothing." In essence, Lear has become nothing by dividing his kingdom. He has lost his kingdom, the power he once had, and the respect he expects to retain. The animal metaphors Lear uses to describe Goneril indicate that he believes she has lost her human feelings. The final exchange advances the plot. Lear won't be able to settle permanently in one location or to move between his daughters when he chooses. Instead, when a daughter treats him too badly or when he gets too mad, or both, he'll move on. In Act 1, Scene 5 of King Lear, Lear's fool, and Kent, still in disguise, enter. Lear sends Kent to Gloucester with a letter. Lear's fool predicts Regan will treat Lear better than her sister has, even though Regan's disposition is essentially just as sour. The fool continues to entertain the king while interjecting surprisingly wise comments about the current situation. Just before they leave to get their horses, Lear openly worries about going mad. Shakespeare uses letters in this scene for dramatic and symbolic purposes. By choosing to send Kent, whom Lear believes he has just met, with a letter, Shakespeare shows how much Lear trusts Kent immediately. In a way, this character trait is both touching and damning. Lear trusts far too easily, and he trusts people because they say what he wants to hear, which is what Kent does, and when they show their loyalty in public, as his daughters did. This brief scene is marked by both verbal irony and foreshadowing. If Regan has the same disposition as her sister does, why would the fool predict her treatment of the king will be better? Lear's comments about madness foreshadow his increasing madness as the play continues, while simultaneously signaling that his self-awareness is growing. In Act 2, Scene 1 of King Lear, back at Gloucester's castle, Edmund and an acquaintance, Curran, discuss the fact that Regan and her husband, the Duke of Cornwall, will be at Gloucester's castle that night. The two men viciously gossip, relating how Cornwall and Albany are feuding. After Curran leaves, Edmund continues to speak of how this news fits with his plans, as his father, Gloucester, is ready to arrest Edgar, and he's excited for the Duke to be in attendance. When Edgar enters, Edmund warns him that their father is coming, and he convinces Edgar that they must pretend to fight. Edgar leaves, and Edmund cuts his own arm with his sword. When Gloucester enters, Edmund then claims his brother has fled after trying to draw Edmund into his plot to murder their father. Shocked, Gloucester issues a death sentence for the villain Edgar. Cornwall, Regan, and their servants enter. Gloucester confirms the rumors of Edgar's treachery. Regan blames Edgar's change in character on his associating with Lear's knights. Cornwall praises Edmund for acting like a good son and vows to punish Edgar severely if he's caught. When Curran and Edmund take the stage, they do so from different directions, indicating that they come from different places. This suggests how widely discussion of the current political upheaval has spread. When Curran leaves the stage, he leaves the play as well, which manages to further suggest a disordered kingdom. People who are intimate with the nobility are simply vanishing. The content of their discussion matters as well. When royalty or nobility clash, everyone is affected. Edmund's manipulation of his brother and father is tantamount to evil genius. When he says to Edgar, "Pardon me, in cunning I must draw my sword upon you," his request for pardon is meant to deceive. How could someone so polite be a villain? Edmund's decision to wound himself and then call for his father's help is similarly convincing. Who else but an attacker could have drawn his blood? His trickery works perfectly. Edgar essentially becomes public enemy number one. Regan, however, is a close second in manipulation, as she manages to tie Edgar's supposed change in character to her consuming issue, the behavior of Lear's knights. Although there is no indication that Edgar is spending time with these men, Regan manages to trace all upheaval in the kingdom back to King Lear. The seeds of treachery and manipulation are being sown. In Act 2, Scene 2 of King Lear, still in disguise, Kent arrives at Gloucester's house. When Oswald greets him, Kent calls Oswald, among other things, a knave, a rascal, an eater of broken meats, a base, proud, shallow, beggarly, three-suited, 100-pound, filthy, worsted-stalking knave, a lily-livered, action-taking knave, a whoreson, glass-gazing, super-serviceable, finical rogue, and then draws his sword and attacks him. When Oswald cries for help, Edmund, Goneril, Cornwall, and Gloucester rush on stage. Cornwall locks Kent in the stocks as punishment. Gloucester protests, arguing that the king will punish Kent for any misdeeds and might take offense if someone else does. But Cornwall says he'll take responsibility. Everyone leaves except Gloucester, who stays with Kent, now in the stocks, long enough to apologize. Once Gloucester leaves, Kent takes out a letter from Cordelia, which says she promises to find a way to make things better. This scene is like a masterclass in medieval rights and hierarchy. Oswald has never done anything terribly wrong to Kent, but Kent responds to him with tremendous anger, calling him practically every insulting name in the medieval book. Kent is profoundly angry because Oswald was rude to Lear, and he is responding on Lear's behalf, defending his honor. When he warns that Lear is likely to want to punish Kent himself, Gloucester is also standing in for the king, speaking up for his concerns and rights. When he stays behind to apologize, Gloucester shows he is loyal to the king. By contrast, Cornwall's decisions should set off warning bells for the audience. When he takes responsibility for Kent's punishment, he is essentially taking the king's place, as he is choosing to discipline one of the king's men, and a messenger at that. The scene is also unexpectedly funny. When he first appears in King Lear in Act 1, Scene 1, Kent is stiffly proper. To hear him rattle off line after line of inventive insults is ridiculous and amusing. Finally, the key role of the letter, spoiler alert, foreshadows Cordelia's eventual return. It is also bittersweet, because the letter promises to make things better, but the worst is yet to come. In Act 2, Scene 3 of King Lear, out in the woods, Edgar is by himself. He's been declared an outlaw and is on the run. He's going to disguise himself by dirtying his face, mussing his hair, and stripping down to almost nothing. As he puts it, "My face I'll grime with filth, blanket my loins, elf all my hair in knots, and with presented nakedness outface the winds and persecutions of the sky." His plan is to pretend to be crazy. This scene is only a paragraph long, and it's the second instance in King Lear in which a good and innocent character chooses to disguise himself in order to remain in the kingdom. Whereas Kent becomes a serving man to blend in with others in Lear's service, Edgar transforms himself into something distinctly wilder. Poor Tom. The scene ends with the line, "Edgar, I nothing am," which shows the fragility of characters' identities in the play. After one good, cunning, ruthless trick by his brother, Edgar's entire life and identity have been stripped away. In Act 2, Scene 4 of King Lear, outside Gloucester's castle, Lear and his fool come across Kent in the stocks. Lear can't believe this, and what's more, he can't get anyone to explain what happened. The fool, who had been joking about the situation, delivers a long speech on how bad a sign this is. Lear goes inside to look for Regan. While he's gone, the fool delivers a longer speech about the lessons Kent should have learned about how the world works. Lear returns with Gloucester, raging because his daughter Regan and her husband, the Duke of Cornwall, have refused to see him. Eventually, Regan and Cornwall come out and set Kent free. Lear begins to rage against Goneril, but instead of taking his side, Regan tells Lear he's likely at fault, that he probably just misunderstands Goneril, doesn't appreciate her value, and that he should apologize to her. When Regan tells him to go back to Goneril, Lear swears he never will and curses Goneril. Oswald enters, followed by Goneril. Cornwall admits he put Kent in the stocks, but claims that Kent absolutely deserved it. Goneril and Regan speak with Lear, arguing that he doesn't need any servants. Lear storms out, shouting that his heart shall break into 100,000 flaws before he will weep, and then he exclaims to his fool that he will go mad. Gloucester, Kent, and the fool accompany him. Regan and Goneril reach an agreement. They'll host their father if he comes back, but no servants allowed. They note there's a storm coming, and they go to lock down the house against the weather. When Lear first sees Kent in the stocks, he is shocked. When Lear asks who put Kent in the stocks, Kent tells him that it was his son and daughter, but Lear refuses to believe the words. When Lear says no, Kent says yes. When Lear says no, I say, Kent says, I say yea. This is mildly funny until Lear erupts with anger, saying the treatment of his man is worse than murder. In Act 1, Scene 1, just a handful of scenes earlier, Lear can banish people and ruin them for talking back to him. Here, just one act later, everyone contradicts him, denies him, and rejects him over and over. It is as if the world is conspiring to show him how his power has declined. The decay of his power and kingdom is in full swing. Not only will Regan give him no answers, but when he asks his daughter to take his side against his other daughter, Goneril, she won't. He tells Regan he'll come to her house with his knights, and she denies him. Regan flatly tells him, "Oh, sir, you are old," and goes on to tell Lear that he should now let others take care of him. This reveals the problems with Lear's original plan. He wanted to step down from the duties of king while also retaining the position's rights and privileges. This scene puts his daughter's cold-heartedness on display when they don't try to stop him from wandering around in a terrible storm they see heading their way. In Act 3, Scene 1 of King Lear, Kent and one of Lear's gentlemen meet in a field. Kent tells the gentleman three things. The king is out in the storm with only his fool for company. Albany and Cornwall are bitterly feuding, and the King of France has sent troops to England to take advantage of all the disorder. Kent says the gentleman to Dover to report on the king's pathetic and perplexing situation. Kent gives him a ring to show Cordelia so she will know the message comes from a genuine source, that is, Kent himself. They then agree to look for the king and to call to each other if they see him, and then they leave in different directions. This is a brief but useful scene. Because Act 2 closes with Lear's daughters essentially consigning their father to the storm, the audience may be wondering about the king's welfare as Act 3 opens. Here, Kent confirms that he is indeed outdoors, wandering around aimlessly in the storm. Lear has been petulant at times, and the audience might doubt his version of the storm, but Kent has been a straightforward, trustworthy source of information. Kent's idea of sending a message to Cordelia provides a sliver of hope that the good daughter will come back. It also continues the motif of written communication. In Act 3, Scene 2 of King Lear, Lear and his fool wander in the terrible storm. Lear rages against the elements and his daughters. His fool comments on his complaints and tries to get him to apologize to his daughters so they can go inside. Kent, who is still in disguise, finds them, and he tries to get Lear into shelter. Lear instead calls for the storm to punish his enemies, referring to his daughters. His mind begins to wander, and he himself says he's going mad. However, he eventually gives in and goes with Kent toward a nearby hut. The fool is left alone in the storm, where he delivers a prophecy about a time when England will be turned completely upside down. This legendary scene is one reason why King Lear is considered hard to perform. It presents a complex blend of the literal and the symbolic, and the symbols are layered on each other closely. When Lear says, "Blow winds and crack your cheeks," he is referring to the literal winds, though he also personifies them as malevolent beings. When he talks about the cataracts and hurricanes having drenched our steeples, drowned the cocks, he is both describing weathercocks in a deluge and making a sexual reference. Lear is the only male in his family, and he's being metaphorically soaked by his daughter's actions. They are engaged in an elemental war of the sexes, and he's losing. The storm is like a punishment that Lear does not deserve. As Lear explains it, I never gave you kingdom, called you children, you owe me no subscription. His daughters, in contrast, have received half a kingdom, each as a reward, and they owe him everything. Yet here he is, out wandering in the storm, ranting and raving. The storm and his daughter's treatment combine to break Lear's mind, and he starts to go mad. Kent and the fool know it, but all they can do is force him into a little shelter. The scene ends with the fool delivering an address on how Britain is turned completely upside down. The speech is far from foolish. In fact, it's spot on. But because he delivers it alone in the rain, only the audience can enjoy it. In Act 3, Scene 3 of King Lear, back at Gloucester's castle, Gloucester complains to his secretly treacherous son Edmund about the state of affairs. Earlier, when he complained about how the king was being treated, he was kicked out of his own house. As Edmund encourages his father, Gloucester tells him he has received a letter telling him armed forces have landed in England. Once his father warns Edmund to be careful and leaves Edmund alone, Edmund instantly announces he'll take this news directly to Cornwall. Edmund plans to speed up his inheritance by betraying his father. He will tell Cornwall that his father is going to see Lear, which is forbidden. Edmund says that he will be rewarded by receiving all of Gloucester's lands. He sinisterly remarks, "The younger rises when the old doth fall." In Act 3, Scene 3, just like most scenes with Edmund, the audience watches Edmund's duplicity in horror, while Gloucester is totally oblivious to it. As a matter of fact, Gloucester's figurative blindness foreshadows horrific events to come. Previously, the audience might have had sympathy for Edmund. Gloucester did father him out of wedlock, and it's essentially ruined Edmund's life, even though Edmund makes jokes about it. It is admirable to try to shape one's destiny as Edmund plans rather than accept fate, but by this scene, roughly in the middle of the play, Edmund's villainy is becoming more evident as events unfold. Here again, Shakespeare uses a letter as a critical form of communication. When Edmund says he's going to go behind his father's back to clue Cornwall in on everything going on, he also mentions sharing the letter with him. While this is a common method of increasing drama, it also illustrates the fragmentation in the kingdom. When King Lear starts, all of the major players in the kingdom talk to one another directly. Now they are scattered and must communicate at a distance via messages that can easily go astray. Matters are complicated by the fact that so many characters are double-dealing, looking out only for their own agendas. In Act 3, Scene 4 of King Lear, still out in the storm, Kent escorts Lear into a hut. At first, Lear sends the fool inside, but refuses to enter the hovel himself. There's a voice from inside. It is Edgar, disguised as poor Tom, a madman. He and the fool join Kent and Lear in the storm. As they talk, Lear grows sympathetic toward the madman, even trying to share his clothes with him. Gloucester joins them and offers shelter, but Lear, who is becoming more and more consumed by madness, says he wants to consult with poor Tom first, whom he calls a philosopher. While Lear and Edgar speak in private, Gloucester recaps Lear's situation as well as his own to Kent. After noting that people say the king is mad, Gloucester says he's afraid he's going crazy himself. They all leave together. This is one of the bitterest scenes in a bitter tragedy, yet it's filled with symbolism and insight. Although the storm and his daughter's betrayal seem to have caused Lear to lose his wits, his mad ravings are marked by more self-awareness than his earlier sane comments revealed. While posing as a madman, Edgar's been complaining about the foul fiend tormenting him, but has never mentioned having daughters. Thus, Lear's talk of daughters is a sign of how far he is from reality, symbolically equating his own daughter's actions with demonic action. He sees the evil in their selfish ways. This scene also clusters all of the good characters who are currently in Britain whose fates are more than related, they are interwoven. In Act 3, Scene 5 of King Lear, back at Gloucester's castle, Edmund and Cornwall enter together, and Cornwall swears revenge on Gloucester. Edmund is worried people will criticize him for siding with Cornwall instead of his own father. He gives Cornwall a letter documenting the fact that Gloucester has been sending information to France. Cornwall promises Edmund's reward for this will be to replace his father as Earl of Gloucester. Just as the previous scene shows the good characters in Britain clustering together, this scene shows the evil ones doing the same thing. By betraying his father to Cornwall, Edmund links his own fate to the Duke of Cornwall's, and he's growing increasingly treacherous. Having displaced his brother, now he has betrayed his father. This scene includes the critical letter, which here is more than just a form of communication. The letter, which initially indicated Gloucester's continuing loyalty to Lear and Cordelia, has been appropriated by Cornwall as evidence of Gloucester's role as a spy for the French. Cornwall fosters this false interpretation, which allows Edmund to gain power over his father. However, Edmund is still operating in the shadow of the law. No doubt about it, he is still a villain. In Act 3, Scene 6 of King Lear, Gloucester, Lear, the Fool, Kent in disguise, and Edgar, also in disguise, are in a chamber of a farmhouse near Gloucester's castle. Gloucester leaves them there knowing it's a better shelter from the open air. Edgar, in character as poor Tom, seems to rave. The Fool continues to comment on the situation. Lear at times answers the Fool, but at other times he spins off into despair. Lear holds a mock trial for Goneril and Regan, and Kent and the Fool play along. But Edgar is so moved by the king's suffering, he's afraid he'll start crying and give away the fact that he is not actually mad. After trying his daughters, Lear calls for them to be dissected to see what is wrong with them before he finally agrees to go to sleep. When Gloucester returns, he begs them to get the king moving toward Dover. There's a plot to kill him, and even half an hour's delay would be too long. Kent and the Fool help the king leave with Gloucester. Lear's mad mock trial and dissection of his daughters causes Kent and Edgar to turn away. But Edgar must stay in disguise or risk his life, yet he's so moved by the sight of Lear trying his daughters, he almost breaks character by weeping openly. The sequence, trial followed by dissection, underscores Lear's emotional pain. Early in the play, he trusts his own judgment of his daughter's actions and characters. Now he turns to the legal profession and then to natural philosophy, or what a modern audience would call science, for help in understanding them. The scene ends with another wise reflection delivered by a pathetic lone figure. Edgar comments that when a man sees that those who are superior to himself have the same problems, it makes him almost forget his own misery, reflecting, when we our betters see bearing our woes, we scarcely think our miseries our foes. Who alone suffers most of the mind, leaving free things and happy shows behind. Edgar claims that the person who suffers alone suffers the most, and that companions in sorrow help alleviate grief. In Act 3, Scene 7 of King Lear, back at Gloucester's castle, Cornwall, Regan, Goneril, and Edmund enter, accompanied by servants. Cornwall tells the servants to seek out the villain Gloucester. Once he is apprehended, Regan thinks they should hang him, while Goneril wants them to pluck out his eyes. Cornwall announces that the French army has landed and wonders where King Lear is. Oswald enters and informs them that Gloucester has helped the king escape to Dover. Oswald, Edmund, and Goneril then take their leave. The servants bring Gloucester in and, at Cornwall's order, tie him up. When interrogated, Gloucester says he helped the king escape because the two sisters treated him so badly that he felt he must protect Lear from what they might do in the future. In response, Cornwall horrifically gouges out one of Gloucester's eyes and stomps on it. One of the servants tries to convince Cornwall to stop. After Regan sneers at the servant, he launches himself at Cornwall, trying to defend Gloucester. The two fight, and the servant wounds Cornwall. Regan runs the servant through with a sword from behind, a cowardly attack, killing him. Cornwall gouges Gloucester's other eye out, crying, "Lest it see more, prevent it! Out, vile jelly!" In pain and despair, Gloucester calls for his son Edmund. Regan adds insult to injury by telling Gloucester it was Edmund who actually betrayed him. She has the servants drive the now blind Gloucester into the night. Cornwall leans on Regan as they exit the stage. The servants who are left behind talk about how unjust their lord and lady are and how badly they are acting. They decide to follow Gloucester to help take care of him. This is the most brutal and disturbing scene in King Lear. Gloucester is a fairly good man and has done nothing except remain loyal to the king to whom he swore loyalty. In response, the conspirators choose to torture him in a gruesome fashion. The blinding of Gloucester, the murderous, cowardly sneak attack by Regan, and Goneril's insistence that Gloucester's eyes be plucked out will certainly end any sympathy an audience has for the sisters. These are the women, the king's own daughters, to whom he left his kingdom, who earlier claimed to love Lear profoundly and completely. In Act 4, Scene 1 of King Lear, Edgar, still disguised, is out on the heath and delivers a speech to say that change is good. Now that he's at the bottom, any change is welcome. An old man, one of Gloucester's peasants, leads Gloucester, who is now blind, into view. Gloucester asks who's there, and the peasant tells him it is a mad beggar. Edgar approaches in his disguise. Gloucester dismisses the old man guiding him, saying the madman can guide him to Dover. After the old man leaves, Gloucester asks Edgar if he knows the way to Dover. When Edgar tells his father that he does, Gloucester pays Edgar to guide him to the top of the highest cliff so he can throw himself off. This is one of the many instances of irony in the play. As soon as Edgar says change is good, he sees his blinded father being led around by an old peasant, an example of situational irony. At least he's alive. There are many possible changes that would be worse. Gloucester's actions also emphasize the theme of madness and foolishness. While it seems crazy for Gloucester to choose a madman rather than his trusted peasant as his guide, the world is so insane that madness seems a perfectly good guide. And while the trusted peasant may try to prevent Gloucester from jumping off a cliff, the madman will be willing to help Gloucester achieve his tragic aim. In Act 4, Scene 2 of King Lear, before Albany's palace, Goneril and Edmund enter, followed by Oswald. Oswald reports that Albany seems changed and is responding to news inappropriately. When he was told foreign troops had landed and that Gloucester had betrayed the rebels, Albany smiled. But when he was told of Edmund's loyalty, he frowned. Goneril says her husband is simply too meek. She'll essentially have to be the masculine one. She kisses Edmund. Once he leaves, she comments on how Edmund, not her husband, deserves her loyalty. Albany then enters. He tells her that she is not worth the dust which the rude wind blows in her face, and that her betrayal of her family is unspeakable. He questions her, saying, "Wisdom and goodness to the vile seem vile. Filths savor but themselves. What have you done? Tigers, not daughters. What have you performed?" Goneril dismisses his words, but Albany insists that the sins Goneril and Regan have committed deserve divine punishment. Goneril rejects both his words as well as his status as a man. A servant arrives and informs everyone that the Duke of Cornwall is dead, killed by a servant for blinding Gloucester. He delivers a letter from Regan to Goneril. Albany quizzes the servant, asking if Edmund knows his father has been blinded. The answer is yes. Edmund is indeed the one who betrayed Gloucester. Albany praises Gloucester for his loyalty, and everyone leaves. This scene conveys some key information. The troops are arriving in Britain, and Cornwall has died from his wounds at the hands of the servant who dared to stand up for Gloucester. The reaction of the characters to this news shows that the forces of evil in the play are now beginning to disintegrate. Cornwall is dead. Goneril and Albany, who once functioned as a team, albeit a nefarious one, are now in conflict with each other. Goneril has rejected her husband as a man, pledging herself to Edmund, whom she's kissing behind her husband's back. Goneril's shift in affection also signals that neither she nor Edmund have the focus needed to reshape a kingdom. Edmund has displaced Edgar and his father, but instead of taking up their duties, he starts an affair. Likewise, Goneril has inherited half a kingdom and disowned her father, but she too commits her energies to an affair. Because both of them should probably be preparing to fight the foreign troops that have just landed, this means that they aren't fit to rule and that they are almost assuredly destined to lose badly. In Act 4, Scene 3 of King Lear at the French camp near Dover, Kent and a gentleman are talking about recent developments. The King of France has had to go back home, but he has left his marshal in charge. Cordelia has read Kent's letters, which caused her to weep and struggle to control herself. Kent tells the gentleman that Lear is in town, but refuses to see Cordelia because he's ashamed of how he treated her. He explains, a sovereign shame so elbows him, his own unkindness that stripped her from his benediction, turned her to foreign casualties, gave her dear rights to his dog-hearted daughters. These things sting his mind so venomously that burning shame detains him from Cordelia. The gentleman explains to Kent that Cornwall and Albany's forces are marching to battle, and Kent asks the gentleman to accompany him, and he'll take the gentleman to the king. This is another brief scene blending necessary exposition with character development. The audience needs to know Cordelia is in Britain, and that her husband has temporarily gone back to France. The first detail heightens the stakes, while the second controls the timeline for the final battle to come. This brief scene also advances the audience's understanding of Cordelia, the good daughter. In Act 1, Scene 1, her reasoning seems sound enough, but the audience has little reason to sympathize with her. Now she's returned home, not as Lear's daughter, but as a queen. Her control over her emotions matches her stature. It seems she was a queen over her passion who, most rebel-like, fought to be king o'er her. In this scene, the audience can also read King Lear as a fight between characters ruled by their passions, Regan and Goneril, and those who are the master of their passions, such as the level-headed and self-controlled Cordelia. In Act 4, Scene 4 of King Lear, at a tent in the French camp at Dover, Cordelia enters with a doctor and some soldiers. She sends some soldiers to look for the missing king. Once they leave, she asks the doctor what can be done. He says that perhaps rest will help the king recover his senses. Hoping her father can be found, Cordelia exclaims, "Seek, seek for him, lest his ungoverned rage dissolve the life that wants the means to lead it." Another messenger arrives, telling her the enemy forces of Cornwall and Albany are getting close. Cordelia hopes she'll soon see her father again, and everyone leaves. This is another scene blending exposition and character development, although there's also some subtle symbolism. The audience learns that Lear is still mad, and that Cordelia wishes to help him, showing her goodness, loyalty, and level-headedness. Whereas Lear made bad decisions about his kingdom of his own volition, Cordelia is wise enough to seek help from professionals, and her calmness and nerves of steel at the news of the approaching enemy force shows the depth of her character. She clearly deserves to be queen more than the increasingly mad Lear deserves to be king. In Act 4, Scene 5 of King Lear at Gloucester's castle, Regan and Oswald are talking about how Albany's forces have arrived. Regan says that blinding Gloucester and leaving him alive was a terrible mistake because now everyone who sees him feels pity for him. It was great ignorance, Gloucester's eyes being out, to let him live. Where he arrives, he moves all hearts against us. She thinks Edmund has gone searching for his father to kill him. Regan tells Oswald to stay with her, but he can't, as Goneril has ordered Oswald to carry a letter to Edmund. Regan tries to persuade Oswald to take her letter to Edmund instead. They part, headed in opposite directions. Once again, the evil characters continue to fight amongst themselves. In this scene, the audience learns how out of balance they are. A man should always be the better soldier, yet Goneril is a fiercer fighter than her husband is. Oswald is Goneril's sworn servant, but Regan tries to bend his errand to her own purpose, showing that she acts only in her own self-interest. Her regret for blinding Gloucester because it garners pity for him shows her gross, selfish immorality. The audience also gets another reminder of the danger inherent in communicating through messengers. One party can always persuade, bribe, or trick a messenger, causing the message to go astray. Once again, Shakespeare uses the key motif of the letter to build tension and increase the stakes. In Act 4, Scene 6 of King Lear, crossing the fields near Dover, Gloucester follows his son Edgar, still disguised as the beggar Poor Tom, who claims he's leading Gloucester up a steep hill to the cliffs of Dover so that Gloucester can leap off and kill himself like he wished. When they reach what Edgar claims is the highest cliff, Gloucester jumps and falls to the ground, unconscious. Edgar rouses his father and spins a story about how high the cliff was and how he saw some devil or spirit beside Gloucester at the top of the cliff. Lear enters, dressed fantastically with wildflowers, and Gloucester says he recognizes the king by his voice. Lear continues to rant, complaining about women. At last, Lear recognizes Gloucester and offers him his eyes so Gloucester can weep over Lear's situation. When some of Cordelia's servants enter, hoping to take Lear to his daughter, who is searching desperately for her father, Lear runs away. Edgar quizzes the servants for news of the battle, and then they leave. Then Oswald enters, intending to kill Gloucester for a reward. Gloucester would welcome death, but Edgar intervenes. Edgar and Oswald have a brief battle, and Edgar kills Oswald. But before Oswald dies, he tells Edgar he's carrying letters for Edmund. Edgar then reads the letters. One is a love letter from Goneril to Edmund. Just then, drums sound, signaling the battle is near, and Edgar leads his father to safety. In Act 4, Scene 6, Shakespeare gives his audience plenty of drama in the form of deception, reversal, reunion, and violence. The deception arrives as a disguised Edgar tricks his father into thinking they've gone up to a cliff. Here, Gloucester takes what might be called a leap of faith. He is helpless, unable to kill himself the way he wants to, and so he must depend on others. He is a pathetic character, but also a brave one, as he thinks he's at the top of the cliffs of Dover when he leaps. Even though he falls only a few feet to the grass, he believes he has fallen a great distance and expects to die. By spontaneously helping his father without a clear sense of what will happen next, Edgar demonstrates his goodness. The evil characters in King Lear act on their own behalf and try to consciously reshape events. The good ones act for others and do not try to control outcomes as forcefully. Oswald's death at Edgar's hands eliminates another bad character. Their solidarity in taking over is getting frayed, and now they're starting to drop. It also shows that Edgar is no longer hiding to protect himself, instead acting to try to right some of the kingdom's wrongs. In Act 4, Scene 7 of King Lear, back at a tent in the French camp, King Lear sleeps as Cordelia, Kent the doctor, and some servants enter. Cordelia acknowledges Kent's character. "O thou good Kent, how shall I live and work to match thy goodness?" She urges Kent to take off his disguise, but Kent says he needs it to finish his duties. Cordelia talks to Lear while he's sleeping, but Lear wakes and he is still disturbed. Eventually, Lear recognizes Cordelia, saying, "If you have poison for me, I will drink it," because she has cause to be angry with him. The doctor pronounces him by and large cured. Lear, Cordelia, and the doctor exit, leaving Kent and one of the gentlemen. The gentleman shares news with Kent. Cornwall is dead, and Edmund is now leading his forces. He also shares false reports about Edgar being in Germany. Both men then leave. This scene confirms Cordelia's wisdom in consulting a doctor. Lear may not be fully recovered, but his madness breaks. Her public praise of Kent shows she is an accurate judge of his behavior, something her father was not at the beginning of the play. The scene also shows how fully humbled and driven by the spirit of repentance Lear is, as he calls himself very foolish and offers to drink poison. This scene also functions as a quiet and at times amusing interlude and calm before the storm that will be the rush of action about to come in Act 5. In Act 5, Scene 1 of King Lear, at the British camp near Dover, Edmund is talking to Regan, and he asks if anyone knows whether Albany's decision remains the same or if he has changed his mind, and he sends a gentleman to find out. As soon as the gentleman leaves, Regan pumps Edmund for gossip, asking if he has slept with Goneril yet. Edmund refuses to answer, saying the question is beneath her. That thought abuses you. Regan tries to convince him she's asking out of her concern about their political plans. Albany and Goneril enter, and Regan reflects to herself that she'd rather lose the battle than lose Edmund to Goneril. Albany is concerned about the French invasion. Then Edgar is brought in, still disguised as a poor beggar, and he asks to speak to Albany. Everyone else leaves, and Edgar gives Albany the letter carried by Oswald, which alludes to the affair between Goneril and Edmund. Edgar says he'll provide a champion to prove by combat what the letter says is true after the battle. Edgar leaves, and Edmund enters to relay information about troop movements to Albany. After Albany departs to prepare his forces, Edmund is alone. He talks to himself about how he's promised himself to both sisters, and how both are like poisonous snakes. To both these sisters have I sworn my love, each jealous of the other as the stung are of the adder. Which of them shall I take? Both, one, or neither? Neither can be enjoyed if both remain alive. Edmund plans to use Albany's authority to win the battle and then kill Lear and Cordelia. In King Lear, good is associated with order and evil with disorder. Edmund refers to Regan and Goneril as different kinds of poisonous snakes. There is no way his affairs with the sisters can end well, and things are about to explode. The ability of the evil characters to maintain their deceptions and lies is breaking down. In Act 1, Edmund delivers subtle lies to mislead his father. In Act 5, when Regan claims she cares about Edmund's relationship with Goneril only because of what it means for their rebellion, she is obviously not being truthful. But this scene also demonstrates Edgar's rising stature. His offer to prove the truth through a trial by combat is heroic. Like so many other characters in King Lear, good or bad, Edgar uses the motif of the letter as a signal of transformation. In Act 5, Scene 2 of King Lear, in a field between the French and English camps preparing for battle, Cordelia leads Lear, followed by the sounds of battle. Edgar enters, leading Gloucester. He leaves his father under the shade of a tree briefly and exits. His return is announced by fainter sounds of battle. King Lear hath lost, he tells his father. He adds that Lear and Cordelia have been captured. Gloucester says the spot is as good a place to die as any, but Edgar convinces him to persevere a little longer, staying positive and saying, men must endure their going hence even as their coming hither. Ripeness is all. Come on. Then the father and son exit. This scene is an extremely brief interlude between the fighting set in motion in the previous scene and the outcome revealed in the following scene. Gloucester's admission that he is ready to die foreshadows impending death. The next scene will be the dramatic, bloody conclusion of the play. In Act 5, Scene 3 of King Lear, Edmund and his soldiers enter their camp with Lear and Cordelia as captives. Edmund sends them to prison and then dispatches a captain to follow and kill them there. Albany, Goneril, and Regan enter, followed by more soldiers. Edmund explains he's imprisoned the king, but Albany objects, saying Edmund is his subordinate. Regan disagrees, saying that it is her decision to make. After bickering with Goneril, Regan claims Edmund as her lord and master. When Goneril asks if Regan means to sleep with Edmund, Albany arrests Edmund for treason and forbids Regan's declaration of marriage to him. As Regan bemoans feeling sick, Albany and Edmund ask for a herald to blow a horn to signal anyone who will prove Edmund a traitor. On the third trumpet blast, Edgar arrives. He won't show his face or give his name, saying he has lost it through treachery, but he also says his blood is as good as Edmund's. The brothers battle, and Edgar wounds Edmund mortally. Goneril flees. Edgar reveals himself and explains how he disguised himself and took care of their father, Gloucester, and that Kent likewise disguised himself to take care of Lear. When Edgar had earlier revealed himself to his father, Gloucester, torn between joy and grief, died. Then a servant enters carrying a bloody knife. Goneril has killed herself, but before that, she confessed to poisoning her sister Regan. Kent enters. Edmund repents his plan to kill Lear and Cordelia and calls for someone to stop it. Edmund is then carried off. Lear enters, carrying Cordelia, lamenting her death via hanging, but hoping she's alive. Lear has killed the man who hanged Cordelia, and at last he recognizes Kent for who he is. A messenger arrives to say that the wounded Edmund has died. Lear reveals that his fool has also been hanged, and then the old king himself dies of grief. Albany tells Kent and Edgar they will rule the kingdom together. But Kent says he has a journey ahead, implying he will soon die. Albany speaks ambiguously, saying, "The oldest hath borne most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." The play ends with a dead march. This final scene's exchanges among Regan, Goneril, Edmund, and Albany are chaotic. The fight between Edmund and Edgar resolves the contest between them, proving Edgar to be the superior brother. Edmund seems to attempt to redeem himself by rescinding his execution order for Lear and Cordelia. This final scene has almost every element of drama an audience could want. A charged argument, a lover's spat, a treason charge, trial by combat, characters dying of broken hearts, revelations of hidden identities, Edmund's change of heart and death, the assassination and suicide of Regan and Goneril, Cordelia's tragic death, revenge against the man who hangs Cordelia, a change of dynasty, and redemption for Cordelia and Edgar. Order is restored through Albany's directive, but with the ambiguous ending, King Lear does not promise happiness for its surviving characters. The crown, the storm, and blindness are the forces at work in the symbols of Shakespeare's play King Lear. King Lear divides his kingdom and sets aside his crown. In Act 1, Scene 4, the Fool shares an extended joke with Lear about crowns. The Fool splits an egg in half, producing two crowns, that is, the two halves of the eggshell, which, considered separately, constitute nothing of great value. The Fool explains through this extended metaphor that this is what Lear has accomplished by dividing his royal crown between his elder daughters, and that he was an idiot for doing so. The storm is another crucial symbol, as some scenes in King Lear take place during a powerful storm, one that is also deeply symbolic of the savage disorder in the kingdom. Lear equates the storm's violence and destructiveness with his daughter's treatment of him. Wandering and soliloquizing during the tumultuousness mirrors the play's beautiful turns of phrase, spouted by characters in inhabiting a collapsing kingdom. Blindness, the inability to see, is a symbol that appears throughout King Lear. The disability is sometimes literal and temporary, for example, Lear's inability to see through Kent's disguise. Blindness is sometimes literal and permanent, as when the Earl of Gloucester's eyes are gouged out. These instances of literal blindness are also symbolic, and other instances of blindness are completely symbolic. These include Lear's inability to see Cordelia's love, or Gloucester's inability to see his son Edmund's treachery. Aging, family relations, madness and foolishness, order and vision are the cornerstone themes of the tragic structure that is Shakespeare's play King Lear. Everything that happens in King Lear occurs because the king is old and weary. His decision to divide his kingdom and step down sets all action in motion, and much of the tragic irony in King Lear revolves around aging. The king, who admits to being old and tired, wants to retire while retaining all the privileges of being a king. His elder daughters think he took too long to step down from the throne. This tension between a younger generation's loyalty to a patriarch versus that generation's desire for power is visible not only in Lear's daughters, but also in the way Gloucester's son Edmund jockeys for early advancement. King Lear addresses family relations, including those between children and fathers and between siblings themselves. A ruler's decision to relinquish his position and depend on his children's love would be fraught in any situation. But in the play, where the decision entails dividing a kingdom, the family intersects with the social order. Family relationships have legal and emotional repercussions. Gloucester laughs about fathering Edmund out of wedlock, although his son's illegitimacy becomes a source of tremendous suffering for his entire family later. Lear doesn't just want his daughters to simply love him, he demands that they publicly proclaim their love. His responses to all three daughters, but especially to Cordelia, show his profound misunderstanding of them. Madness and foolishness permeate King Lear, where many characters attempt to reason clearly and determine the right course of action, but often they are blinded by self-interest, naivete, or excessive trust. When characters set aside their rationality through either madness or foolishness, they see and speak more clearly. The king's fool is the first to do this. He accurately and bitterly diagnoses the situation in the kingdom, taxing Lear for his misjudgment. In dividing his kingdom, Lear disrupts the order of his nation, his household, and his family. Lear's fool provides commentary on this disruption of order many times. Historically, it is one of a court fool's roles to comment on events no one else can address, but in King Lear, the fool must do so throughout the play. And the play comments on disorder in many other ways, like how Cordelia and Kent are loyal to Lear, but he banishes them. Vision is a major theme throughout King Lear. Shakespeare explores this theme in literal and symbolic ways. These explorations begin in the play's first scene. Before Lear ever appears on stage, other characters, Kent and Gloucester, discuss changes recently seen in him. Lear later acts as if he can see into his daughters' hearts, but he quickly shows he cannot penetrate their words or Kent's disguise. And then there's the Earl of Gloucester's eyes being gouged out. His loyalty to the king is seen through to the end. In the introduction to William Shakespeare's tragedy, King Lear, the king holds a public ceremony to divide his kingdom among his daughters, during which he asks his three daughters to declare their love for him. The older two daughters, Goneril and Regan, make great declarations of love, and each receives a third of Lear's kingdom. Lear's youngest daughter, Cordelia, objects to her sister's false flattery and won't take part in the ceremony. Outraged, Lear strips her of her dowry and divides the remaining third of the kingdom between Goneril and Regan. The King of France accepts Cordelia as his wife without a dowry or her father's approval. Banished by her father, Cordelia goes to France and becomes queen. When the Earl of Kent objects to Lear's treatment of Cordelia, Lear banishes him as well. In the rising action, Edmund, son of the Earl of Gloucester but born out of wedlock, plans to betray and displace his brother Edgar. He convinces his father that Edgar is plotting treason, and Gloucester exiles Edgar under pain of death. Kent remains loyal to Lear, and he disguises himself so he can stay with the king and serve him. Neither daughter wants King Lear in her home, and both manipulatively find ways to cast him out. Lear finally rages off into the night and ends up wandering in a terrible storm accompanied by his fool. When Gloucester tells Edmund that French forces have landed in England to help restore Lear to the throne, Edmund betrays his father by telling Regan, Goneril, and their husbands that Gloucester is working with the French. When the Duke of Cornwall, Regan's husband, discovers that French forces have landed, he and Regan punish Gloucester by gouging out his eyes. Gloucester, now blind, is turned out to wander through the countryside. Edgar, disguised as poor Tom, a beggar, finds and guides his father, who asks Edgar to take him to the high cliffs of Dover so he can jump off and commit suicide. Edgar says he will, but he leads his father instead to a low ledge and tricks him into thinking he has survived a great fall. Cordelia returns from France and joins forces with Kent. She takes care of her father as a battle looms between French forces supporting Lear and rebel forces led by Edmund and backed by Regan and Goneril. Lear largely regains his sanity. Edgar kills Oswald, Goneril's steward, when he tries to kill Gloucester. Edmund's forces capture Lear and Cordelia. Edgar reveals his identity to Gloucester, who dies of grief. Edmund sends Lear and Cordelia to prison with orders to kill them. Albany charges Edmund with betraying the king and says he'll prove Edmund's treason through one-on-one combat. In the climax of the play, Edgar appears as an anonymous knight and volunteers to fight Edmund, wounding him mortally and then revealing his identity. Edmund dies a few moments later. Goneril poisons Regan and stabs herself. In the falling action, Lear enters carrying Cordelia, who has been hanged. Lear and his fool also die. In the resolution, Albany tells Kent and Edgar they will rule the kingdom together until order has been restored. The titular King Lear and the members of his collapsing kingdom comprise the characters in William Shakespeare's King Lear. The tragic play follows Lear from the throne into exile. King Lear's world falls apart because he trusts too much, thinks he can manipulate events, tell who loves him, and stay king even after setting his throne aside. He is proud and full of power at the start of the play, but he crumbles into doubt, madness, and death. The bastard Edmund schemes first to displace his brother Edgar, and then to betray his father, the Earl of Gloucester, who fathered him out of wedlock. He lies, manipulates, and has affairs with both Regan and Goneril. When he is charged with treason, he fights an anonymous challenger who is seeking to prove Edmund's guilt through trial by combat. This unknown knight is Edgar, who gets revenge on Edmund. Edgar starts the play quite naive, and he is quickly taken in by his brother's schemes. Once he's banished after a dastardly trick by his brother, he disguises himself as poor Tom, a crazy beggar, to stay in the kingdom. He cares for his father, showing his loyalty. Edgar guides his father, literally, as he's blinded. Edgar rises in stature throughout the play, killing the treacherous Goneril's servant Oswald and his own traitorous brother Edmund. The Earl of Gloucester is an older and very loyal nobleman within Lear's kingdom. Gloucester has two sons, Edgar, his older and legitimate son, and Edmund, who is illegitimate. Gloucester is deceived by his wicked son Edmund's betrayal of Edgar, and he ends up banishing his elder son. The Duke of Cornwall punishes him for his loyalty to Lear by disgustingly gouging his eyes out. Looked after by Edgar in disguise, he eventually dies. When Lear divides his kingdom at the beginning of the play, Cordelia refuses to ostentatiously declare how much she loves her father. Thus, he strips her of her dowry. Only the King of France is willing to marry her without a dowry. Absent through most of the first three acts, she returns to Britain late in the play, bringing French forces with her. In the final battle, the rebel forces capture and hang her. Because of her steadfast loyalty to her father, she is a saintly figure throughout King Lear. Goneril is a true villain. She and her sister lie to their father the king about how much they love him, and by acting to erode Lear's authority and position. She's married to the Duke of Albany, but as she rebels against her father and seeks power, her relationship with her husband deteriorates. She begins an affair with Edmund. When he's killed, she poisons her sister Regan and stabs herself. Like her sister Goneril, Regan is a true villain, finding ways to undermine her father's authority. She and Goneril turn their father out to wander in a storm. Regan suggests that her evil husband, the Duke of Cornwall, blind Gloucester for his treachery. When a servant tries to prevent this, she picks up a sword and kills him. And just like Goneril, she begins an affair with Edmund and dies after he's killed, when Goneril poisons her.